introduction. Okay, Buju, Shingavis, Indigo, Neme, Totem, Alan Yurtsa, Dishnikaz. We're here today talking about wild rice. This is part of the Couchiching First Nation Community Wild Rice event. In the past, we've usually gone out in canoes within the local watershed area, which is Rainy Lake. And our ancestors went out in canoes and they had these thrashing sticks, and we used to be able to harvest our wild rice in this area, but we have not been able to do this for the past 10 years due to high water levels in this area. So what we have been doing, we've been buying our wild rice from the Wabigoon watershed. It's extremely north of us, and so they're not, I guess they don't fall victim to a water level threat in that area. That's why they're able to harvest wild rice, and we're not able to, because our water levels are just a little too high for that. And that's another story. But anyways, we buy our wild rice out of the watershed area and we bring it here. Now once it comes here, it comes straight from the lake, and we call it green rice. Now when we call it green rice, it comes right from the lake into the canoe. What they do is they bag it up, and then we go there and we pick it up. And then when it comes here, the process starts with drying it out. So they take the wild rice and they lay it out onto these tarps, and by the power of the sun, the heat will dry up the husks and sort of crystallize the rice. I guess you can call them kernels, or the rice itself, and that's how it gets a little seasoned. So you dry it out probably 3 or 4 days in the sun, turning it over and over and over, and making sure that the kernel itself on the inside is a little bit ripe, is what it is. So at that point, once we think that the rice is ready and it's nice and dry, it's ready to go into the tubs. Now this process we call roasting. Now when we're roasting the rice, we're using it's a paddle stroke. I forget what it's called, but it's a particular stroke that they use. Now if you look at the way the native people are doing it, it's almost like if you were sitting in a canoe, it's almost like you would just be sort of just sitting in one spot if you were in a canoe, and then just sitting there in one spot, you know, is what you're doing. But what you're doing is you're making yourself comfortable so that you're able to just sort of paddle all day. And there's a lot of I guess you could say some teachings involved with that, with the whole process when you start with the roasting, because it's going to take a long time and it involves patience. So I mean, and that's always a good thing, you know. I mean, it does teach you patience. I mean, this whole week with the rough weather and that kind of stuff, and allowing the I guess the rice to season up, and the roasting, so that goes on. So we do have these bags of rice, and on average it'll take about 3.5–4 hours to roast a bag of rice properly. And now once that's done, we bag it up and we bring it over to the thrashers. Now what the thrasher does, it's got these it's got these rubber ends on it, and it just knocks the rice around and takes the husks off the rice. And the machine itself will shoot the husks out the top, and that's just it just flows, you know, it just flies away, you know, in the wind. And there's also a small teaching in that the birds will come back later and sort of feed off of it. So there's always tons of geese and ducks and those kinds of things around here, and that's usually just part of the process, and that the whatever's left over will sort of go to like the animals, the birds, the deer, that kind of stuff. They usually come in later and almost clean it up, you know, like the husks and that kind of stuff. so. And then everybody's sort of satisfied with their rice, and then they just take it home. Okay, with the water levels on the Rainy Lake area, they're controlled by a government organization called the IJC, the International Joint Commission. Now these are the guys that set water levels for the Rainy Lake watershed area. And generally the water levels that they do set, in accordance with their rule curve, is not conducive to the growing of wild rice in this area. The International Joint Commission, they have special lobby groups that ask them or petition for high water levels because they have docks. There's like the tourist area, there's the cottage industry. All that, I guess, overrides the First Nations need for water levels for the wild rice. So that's why there really is no wild rice in the Rainy Lake area. So we have to go out and buy our water, or buy the wild rice from another area.
The way the IJC was controlling the water through the dams, people were saying, you know, this is not necessarily good for natural resource. What is it doing to the northern pike population when you draw down Kaptogama Lake up to 9-10 feet a year and you take the water away from all the vegetation where their little eggs end up, you know, being put on during spawning when the water's not there? What is it doing to the walleye populations? What did the dams do on the Seine River? There's 6 dams or so on the Seine River. What did it do to the sturgeon population above the dam on the Seine River, right above the Seine River First Nations homeland? Well, essentially what it did is it took out all the sturgeon, and there aren't any in that stretch of the river for a long, long way. What is it doing to the spawning of the sturgeon below the dam when dam operators are letting tons and tons of water out and flushing out the place, or they're not letting water out and the river dries out when spawning goes on? In other words, what's the timing of generating electricity relative to the timing of the spawning and the producing of new sturgeon and walleyes? Are they in sync? No, not necessarily. What is it doing to the wild rice, the manomen? What is it doing? What happened out in Rat Lake area there, south of the Seine River First Nations, on Rainy Lake, where the traditional wild ricing areas were? When you raise and lower water levels at the wrong time for wild rice, guess what? You don't get any wild rice. And what happens if you have a whole pile of alien species come in, water species come in, like cattails, hybrid cattails that come in here, and they start growing in the area where the wild rice beds are, and eventually they replace the wild rice beds.
Usually what happens when you have a hybrid, they carry both traits of both parents, and normally, you know, the fitness part of the environment is like, you know, they take the best traits of both, and then that makes them, you know, this super ultimate species, and so then they are really good at, you know, invading areas and pushing other species out. And what this one actually is really good at, it's not good at proliferating through seeds, but it's really good at proliferating through cloning itself, using from the rhizomes that it puts out through the roots. So it can just constantly shoot these things out. It allows it to colonize a larger range of the water shoreline, so that it can actually create what we call floating mats, where all these root systems from the rhizomes are intermingled, and it just, you know, pushes out into the water, out to potentially up to 5 feet deep of water line. So that obviously causes issues with wild rice, and the fact that wild rice is usually between 1 and 3 feet of water, and if these mats grow out past that, they create pretty much a shade barrier that completely cuts off light, and therefore it also doesn't allow the floating leaf stage of rice or the actual seed head to come out of the water, and completely blocks it. But the good thing is that rice seed holds very well for a long period of time underwater. And so we do have a native, or we do have a natural seed bed under there. We just need to remove the thing that's, the light, the one that's not allowing the light to go through to allow it to grow. And so that's really how it, how it can push wild rice out of its natural range in the watershed. So the initial thing for us is to target these mats, which coincidentally overlap with where this wild rice is growing, and try to take those mats out. And what we use is we use two machines. One's called a cookie cutter. It looks like it's a barge with a really large sideways, looks like kind of like a mower deck. It's got two big blades, and it can operate successfully in about 1 foot to maybe 2 foot of water, so it can get fairly shallow. And then it just cuts everything up. The whole floating mat, it just chews it up as it goes along, and that chewing allows it to kill the rhizome, which is the big issue with the mat. And so then once that goes through and it pretty much mows and chews all this material up, then the harvester, which looks like a big conveyor belt on a barge, comes in and it picks all that material up, pulls it onto the barge, and then we dump it along the shoreline, usually above, and with the Corps of Engineers, above the high water mark, ideally. And so that removal allows then the sun to penetrate. It allows all the submergent vegetation that was once there to come back and recolonize, and allows the rice to, especially the native seed bank, to come back. Now, some areas we've seen that the native seed bank, because it's had the mat over it for so long, it isn't as robust as what a seed that's 5 years old versus 30 years old. Obviously, you'll have a lot more germination, or a higher germination rate with younger seeds. So in those areas where the plants that come back aren't as in good of health, we do supplementally seed back native rice. We do that. We don't really know how long we reset succession of that native vegetation community, or native vegetative community, and we don't really know. Is it something that you're gonna have to do every 2 years, every 5 years, every 10 years? But the nice thing is like in the natural ecosystem, we actually have a species of aquatic mammal, the muskrat, that actually prefers to forage on typha, on cattail, and they make their huts out of it, and they eat it like crazy, especially when it's young. Spring and summer, they really like it. It seems like, and so the idea is that, okay, well, if we go in here and we do all this work, we want to make sure that it's going to be maintained, and muskrats are really good wetland maintainers. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at, okay, historically populations have been declining across North America of muskrats without a whole lot of reasons. So we started looking into, all right, well, what's going on with muskrats? What's their survival rates? Where are they moving? And then we also started to transplant muskrats from one area into specific wetlands and look at certain wetlands that are controlled, that don't have any artificially increases in wetland or muskrat populations, and then what we're also transplanting into other wetlands. And so then we can look at what are the responses, from the vegetation, what are is there any type of density-dependent survival responses? If we can continue to have muskrat populations that are stable and if we can increase them in a way that allows them to continually maintain these cattail populations, hopefully that will either not only stop the continued spread of the remaining cattails that are there that we can't get to, or at least slow down the progression of it coming back. And so that allows us to maintain that wetland using a biocontrol, really.
When civilization comes, the planet ages quickly. A watershed is an area that you can draw a line around, and inside that line, the land is set up in such a way that all the water stays within that area and eventually leaves and goes somewhere else. All the water within Rainy Lake and the rivers that run into it and all that kind of good stuff, okay? And then we can talk about the Lake of the Woods watershed. And the watershed, Lake of the Woods, is huge. I mean, it's huge. the Rainy Lake watershed waters go into the Lake of the Woods watershed waters. And guess where the Lake of the Woods waters go? They go into the Lake Winnipeg watershed and eventually into Hudson Bay.
So copper nickel mining, especially when done in what they call sulfide ores, where there's sulfur mixed with the metal they're trying to mine, when it's mined, it creates a lot of waste rock, and that waste rock contains sulfates, which is a form of sulfur. What we know from research into wild rice is that the sulfates can harm wild rice, and in fact, in waters where there are high levels of sulfate, wild rice can't grow at all. And so before we had a lot of disturbance in the watersheds of Minnesota, wild rice used to grow across our entire state. Now it only grows in relatively small areas, mostly in northern Minnesota, where there's less disturbance in the watersheds where the wild rice can grow. And particularly when it comes to mining, that sulfate contamination, that pollution, is the real issue for the survival of wild rice in northern Minnesota. There are other factors, of course, which affect wild rice and its ability to grow, including water levels and all sorts of other issues. But really, from our perspective, chemically, the pollution created by mining does pose a threat to all the wild rice stands that are downstream of proposed copper nickel mines in northern Minnesota. This idea that wild rice is a canary in the coal mine is a good analogy, because wild rice as a plant is very sensitive to changes in its environment. Where wild rice thrives is almost always a very pristine and healthy ecosystem. And where wild rice cannot grow is oftentimes a degraded ecosystem. And so because of that, it's a good analogy. First is all of these copper nickel mines in the United States and elsewhere that are in this kind of sulfur-bearing rock create long-term water pollution, both of groundwater and surface water. And the question then is, can you contain it? Can you prevent it from escaping? And in almost all cases, water will win. Water flows downhill, water flows downstream. And controlling polluted water and keeping it in one spot is virtually impossible.
Well, first I want people to understand that Water Legacy was formed in 2009 by citizens, mostly in northern Minnesota. And several of our citizens had long-term relationships with members of various indigenous tribes in Minnesota. And our belief from the beginning is that the tribes were our partners, but not only that, but that we were coming in, seeing them as experts. Many of the issues that we're working on, whether it's protecting wild rice or reducing pollution, are issues that tribal communities and tribal scientists have been working on for decades. And that's particularly true in the area of wild rice. One of the worst problems in Minnesota with sulfate is we already have a lot of mercury as a result of burning coal and oil that's in our sediments. And there's a process where bacteria in the presence of sulfate change that mercury into methylmercury, and that accumulates up the food chain. So the level of methylmercury in fish at the top of the food chain can be as much as 1 million times more than in the water. And that methylmercury is a neurotoxin. And babies, infants, children are particularly sensitive to that toxic chemical. So when we're talking about bringing sulfide mining to Minnesota, we're also talking about increasing the risk of reduced IQ and mental problems for fetuses, infants, and children downstream of those mines. There is a lot of work ahead, and I think that the PolyMet Sulfide Mine Project is really the focus of Water Legacy's concern, because we all know that PolyMet is the quote-unquote snowplow behind which all of the other mines in Minnesota, whether in the Boundary Waters watershed or the Mississippi River watershed, will follow. And so if we don't get it right and force PolyMet permits to be either rejected or completely changed to fit science and law, all of Minnesota waters in northern Minnesota, and many of them in the middle of Minnesota as a result of Mississippi River, we're all going to be at risk. And what happened so far is permits were issued for the PolyMet mine both by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And those permits are on appeal. And all these permits were issued without protecting Minnesotans, without protecting our water, without protecting our health, and without even protecting our taxes from the potential liability. And what we've what's happened this past few months, Water Legacy made a motion in connection with the Polymet water pollution permit to send that permit back to the district court, because what we discovered as a result of whistleblowers and Freedom of Information Act cases and Data Practices Act is that political appointees in Minnesota and the federal government were in cahoots, and they suppressed information from the scientists at the federal government that said that the Polymet permit was weak, that it would not protect health, not protect the water, and would violate the Clean Water Act. And so instead of our regulatory agencies protecting us and protecting our water, they were protecting Polymet. And in really the first time in Minnesota history, the Court of Appeals sent a permit case to the district court to look into procedural irregularities and see what the truth is, and stayed the permit, basically suspending the water pollution permit for Polymet until we got the truth about procedural irregularities. Right now, then, we are moving forward to try and make sure not just that the Polymet permit doesn't go forward as a weak and potentially corrupt permit, but that we restore a sense of integrity to Minnesota government so that we can trust our regulators to protect water and to protect health and to protect citizens instead of protecting industry.
When I go out and I stand on a ridge in Voisers National Park on 2.7 billion year old rock and look at a beautiful lake, one of the biggest lakes in the whole world, and I see the beautiful forest and I see the sky and I think about all the wildlife and all these things, how can you not want to say, I'm thankful for this, I'm part of this, I want to learn more about this, and I want to make sure that it stays in a state that is sustainable for the future.
Hey ya, 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 hey, hey ya, hey.